Okay. Can we hit the lights? It'll get very dark, but hopefully, this is very washed out. Is that okay with everyone?
Yes.
Okay. Good. No one's going to misbehave or anything. We're just okay. Good. Okay. So we're doing a virtual tour of Jewish Prague, and obviously there's a tremendous amount to see in Prague. But Prague is a city with a tremendous background in Judaism. First of all, it's known as the Golden City, capital today of what's called the Czech Republic. Of course, it used to be called Czechoslovakia, and way before then it was called Bohemia. The Jews have been living in Prague since 970. So 970, just to give you an idea when that was, right, the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. Okay, 70 of the Common Era. 150 years later, Bar Kokhba revolt. Okay, we're talking about 150 or 160 of the Common Era. Okay, so 970 is only about 800 years after the Jews were really exiled from Israel by the Romans. So it's a very, very early settlement. 1096, the Jewish community there were persecuted terribly because of the Crusades. As you know, Crusaders cut a swath through Europe and murdered tens of thousands of Jews on their way to the land of Israel. Of course, the very famous siege of Prague Castle in 1142, and that's when the Jewish quarter and the synagogues were burnt down. In 1215, the Lateran Council, which is of course of the Vatican, the Catholic Church, required Jews to wear distinctive clothing. We'll see soon the origin of the Jews of Prague is a special hat which the Jewish community had to wear. All Jews, when they left the ghetto, had to wear a special hat. Mid-14th century, Emperor Charles relinquished some power of the Jews in return for large amounts of money. There was always, I should point out, a little bit of a battle between the church authorities and the local rulers. And this is true in much of Europe. Of course, it came to its height with King Henry VIII in England. But in Europe, the battle was the following: that the church rulers generally wanted to restrict the rights of Jews, restrict where Jews would live, restrict what Jews would do, and basically oppress us in any way they could. Whereas the local nobility, the kings, who were interested in the economic success of their country, realised that this is stupid. Here you've got a group of productive, bright people who would contribute tremendously to the economy and to the science and to every other aspect of the country. So they tended very usually, unless the leaders were religious Christians like Maria Theresa, etc., the leaders tended to be more liberal towards the Jews, and the church tended to be more vicious and anti-Semitic. Right? When I say the leaders were liberal, don't get the idea that they were saying, oh, Jews can do anything they want. Right? They were not prepared to give us citizenship. They were not prepared to let us live anywhere we wanted, and they were not prepared to give us any access to everything. But nevertheless, compared to the church, they were quite liberal. We have a very famous, infamous pogrom in the Easter of 1389. Easter and Christmas were always popular times for massacres of Jews in Europe. This was a time where everyone would be inflamed with religious passions, usually by the priests, and they'd go out and they'd kill some Jews. So in Easter, there was the famous desecration of the host libel. Anyone know what the desecration of the host is? According to traditional Catholic doctrine, there's a wafer. You have during the Eucharist, they have wine and a wafer. The wine is believed, it's called the doctrine of transubstantiation. It is believed that the wine turns into the blood of Jesus, and the wafer turns into his flesh. And, of course, the community eats some of the flesh by taking some wafer, and drinks some of his blood by drinking the wine. The origin of this is the cult of Mithras in Rome, which was a pagan cult, which Christianity adopted some of their practices. So anyway, what Jews were accused of was desecrating the host. We were accused of stealing the wafer, it's called the host, from the church and torturing it. Because they believed that the wafer was the baby Jesus. So the Jews torturing the wafer, what are we doing? We're reenacting what we did a long time ago, which is the crucifixion. So therefore, now, think of the evil of the Jews here. Because the only reason you'd ever torture the wafer is if you believed that it really was Jesus, correct? So they'd say the Jews really know the truth, which is that the wafer is Jesus, and yet they're so evil, they're willing to torture the wafer. Do you see how perverse this anti-Semitism was. But again, we think it's bizarre, right? People are arrested for torturing a cookie. But basically, and Christian witnesses would come forth and they'd say, oh yes, we saw it bleed and we heard the wafer scream, etc. Of course, these are the same people who'll chew and digest that wafer, which is probably not pleasant for Jesus either, come to think of it, right? But you see, the Jews were accused of, and there was a very infamous pogrom. We'll talk about that later in Easter of 14th century. 15th century, one of the earliest Jewish presses was established. One of the earliest Haggadot ever was printed there. That you can find at the moment. It's in the auction house in New York, Sotheby's, but it's part of the Val Madonna collection of a famous Jew, Lanzer, who has over 30,000 ancient books. He has the first Haggadah printed in Europe, which of course was in Prague. The nobility gave Jews certain privileges. Later on, the Jewish population doubled. If you go through history, the Jews were expelled, then they were allowed back, they were expelled again. Maximilian and Rudolf were weak leaders, not very religious, and hence it was very good for the Jews, right? So we had economic freedom, flagging the Jewish cause. There were scientists, philosophers, and other intellectuals going into Prague. By early 18th century, Prague was the largest Jewish city in the world. Like New York today, well, actually Tel Aviv today, right? But Prague was really the largest. In fact, in 1708, Jews were a quarter of Prague's population. 1/4 of Prague's population, 17. And of course, this really upset Maria Theresa because she was a very religious Catholic. So the fact that the Jews had freedom in Prague, had economic success, scientific success, was really galling to her. So she expelled the Jews. Of course, they came back 3 years later because there was a lot of under Emperor Joseph, and he issued edicts of tolerance and etc. There was civil equality. The ghetto was abolished. In 1830, most of the Jews adopted German language and culture. And, of course, that meant that from the point of view of the Czechs, the Jews were even more foreign than before. Because aside from being Jewish, now we are allied with the Germans. Right? And then, in the 20th century, a lot of assimilation amongst the Prague Jews. 2 very famous Prague Jews who assimilated completely, totally lost their Jewishness. One converted to Christianity. His name was Gustav Mahler, the famous composer. And the other one, who didn't convert to Christianity, but did abandon Judaism completely, was Franz Kafka. Both 2 very famous Jews of Prague, quite assimilated. And in World War II, there were 55,000 Jews in Prague, i.e. 20% of Prague's population during the Second World War. About 2/3 were killed in the Holocaust. And 74,000 in Terezin, which was a very famous concentration camp. 80% of those sent to Auschwitz, Treblinka and Sobibor. After World War II, of the 55,000 Jews, only 13,000 remained. By 1950, about half of them had made Aliyah and gone to Israel. So the Soviet takeover stopped further immigration. Today, the registered community is 1,600, which is tiny, but the estimates are that there's at least 5,000 to 6,000 Jews there. Why aren't they registered? Because if you grew up under the communists, or if you remember the anti-Semitism of the Holocaust, you're going to register yourself as a Jew? Not likely. So there's probably about 5,000 to 6,000 Jews, but only about 1,600 registered. So now let me come to the actual Jewish community. I'm going to focus primarily on the ancient, what's called the Josephov, which was the Jewish town of Prague. This is a map of Josephov, and you'll see some of the major streets and some of the major attractions there. We'll talk about them, but it's a very small area. In other words, to walk for, let's say, from here to here is about 10 minutes. So you think about it, there were times in history where there's 55,000 20,000 Jews, and they're in a tiny, tiny area which you can walk literally from one end to the other in 15 minutes. And the Jews were not allowed to expand outside that area. Hence the cemetery, the old Jewish cemetery, is tiny. There are at least, they estimate about 17 layers of graves there. They just would bury on top of each because there was no room. They weren't allowed to expand. So now let's have a look at some of the famous personalities. One of the earliest is Rabbi Victor Kara. I don't know if anyone recognises that name, but Kara is a very famous name. Author of the Code of Jewish Law. Right, Joseph Caro was actually a descendant, Shulchan Aruch, was a descendant of Rabbi Victor Kara. Victor Kara witnessed his parents being slaughtered by a Christian mob when he was about 13, during that torture of the host libel. And he wrote a very beautiful elegy, tearjerker, which we actually read on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, as part of our service commemorating the destruction. The Maharal, of course, the most famous figure of Prague, very heavily associated, Rabbi Yehuda Lerver of Prague, one of the greatest of our philosophers and Kabbalists who ever lived. Rabbi Mordechai Rabbi David Ganz, who was a historian and an astronomer. Of course, very famous astronomers lived in Prague. Tycho Brahe was there for a while, Johann Kepler. In fact, the last time I was in Prague, I stayed in an old hotel. It's a hotel which has renovated old houses in the old city of Prague. And the room I was in, there's a plaque on the wall that Johann Kepler slept in this room. So I was in the room that Johann Kepler slept, because I thought that was very cool. And of course we have some very other. The Shlomo Ephraim, he was the head of the yeshiva in Prague. He's very famous for what's called Kliyaka. It's a commentary on the Chumash, commentary on the 5 books of Moses. He wrote the commentary at the command of his doctor. He was the head of the yeshiva, used to give Talmud classes. But he was very sick, and the doctor felt it was too much of a strain on him to teach. It was too much of a strain to teach Talmud. So he told him he needs to take a vacation from teaching Talmud. It was too much of a strain. So he stops teaching Talmud. What does he do during his vacation? He writes a commentary on the entire Torah. So summer vacation coming up, if anyone's interested, right? But basically that's Kliyaka. And then you have a Horowitz, who was a very famous Kabbalist, Rabbi Yontif Lippmann Heller, who wrote one of the greatest commentaries on the Mishnah, Rabbi Yonason Eibeshutz, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, who's very famous for his responsa literature. And, of course, Franz Kafka, Gustav Mahler, to distinguish them from these great Jews. This is the Jewish quarter, Josephov, as it appeared just before, during the First and Second World War. I don't know the exact year of this picture, but this is basically, the Jews would live, even before the Second World War, most of the Jews concentrated in the ghetto of Prague, and this was a typical street in Josephov of Jews living there together during the Second World War. Here was you see a hotel there, right, in the street. That same street, this is how the same street looks today. So as you can see, Josephov today, the ancient Jewish ghetto, is one of the ritziest areas of Prague. Right, you go there, all the famous Prado, right, and I can't even think of any other stores, but all the very famous, right, fashion stores, right, and the very, very, haute couture and very expensive stores are all in the area of the old ghetto, the old Jewish quarter. Very spruced up, very beautiful, very nice streets there. Now, you contrast it to what it was just before the Second World War, is what it is now, right? It's pretty quite interesting to see that contrast. Probably the most famous building in Europe, the most famous Jewish building in Europe, certainly the most famous building in Prague, is known as the Alt Neuschule. The Alt Neuschule, which literally means, what does Alt Neu mean? Old New. In German it means Old New, right? Why is it called the Old Neuschule? Because you see, after that infamous fire where the Christian mobs burnt down the old synagogues, they burnt down the old synagogues. So they built this synagogue. So then they built some other. So this was called the new synagogue, the Neuschule. But then they built some newer ones. So this one was called the Alt Neuschule, meaning the old New Shul, and the other one was called the New Shul. That's one explanation. The other explanation is, in Hebrew, what does Al-Tnoi mean in Hebrew?
Tel Aviv.
Huh?
Tel Aviv.
No, Al-Tnai.
Tel Aviv is called after Al-Tnai.
No, on the condition. Al-Tnai means on condition. So it's the synagogue on condition. What does it mean on condition? There's a famous piece of Talmud in Tractate Megillah which says every synagogue outside of Israel is conditional. Meaning only synagogues in Israel have permanent sanctity. But outside of Israel, every synagogue has only temporary sanctity. Why does it only have temporary sanctity? It's only sanctified until the time that the Jews will move to the land of Israel, as we're all supposed to do. Right? And so therefore, what happens is, it's al-Tanai, it's a conditional shul. So that's another explanation. Now, this is the synagogue. Now, look at the state of this building. This was built. Anyone have any idea when this was built? In approximately 1320. Can you imagine anything being built today, any house that you know of today, right, that would actually be built and people might still be using it 750 years into the future? I can't imagine it. Right? But anyway, they built very well, and here is the famous Alt Neuschule. Now, this was there were many shuls in Prague. In the time of the Maharal, there were 7 shuls, synagogues in Prague. However, the main shul was the Alt Neuschule, and this became particularly associated with the Maharal. Here's a floor plan of the shul. As you see, these are the original walls of the shul from the 13th century, and stuff got built around it. Look at the thickness of these walls. Why were the walls built that way? Very simple, because when there were pogroms, which unfortunately happened all too often, where would the Jews take refuge? They'd take refuge in the synagogue. Right? And so the synagogues, many synagogues, ancient synagogues in Europe were built like fortresses, because they had to be a fortress, and the Jews would take refuge in these synagogues. Now, originally when it was built, there's the bima from which the Torah is read, there's the Holy Ark. Right? Now, around here, originally when the synagogue was built, there was no women's gallery. Generally, women didn't go to synagogue. It was unusual. Women didn't go to synagogue. So then afterwards, what they built around here a little later was that's the women's gallery. Now, there's actually a famous story that one of the rabbis, Rabbi Chezkel Landau, used to sit late at night and study in the women's gallery around there. So now, you see this window, he had a view to the ark. So he's sitting there late at night, it's in the middle of the night, and he's studying Talmud, and he looks up and he hears something. He looks up and he sees through the window a Christian priest with a glass flask in his hand, walking to the ark, to the Holy Ark. What do you think he was doing? It was a flask of blood. He was going to plant it in the ark and then accuse the Jews of the very famous, infamous blood libel, that we killed Christians for their blood. So Rabbi Yechezkel Landau sees this priest with this flask of blood, and he puts it in the ark. Then the priest leaves, presumably to inform people and get the mob. So Rabbi Landau runs into the synagogue and he grabs the flask. What does he do with it? There's no bathrooms here. They don't have plumbing. 13th century, there's no such thing as plumbing, indoor plumbing, right? So he pours it on the ground. They're going to see a pool of blood. He drinks it. He drinks it. Keep in mind, he's saving the lives of hundreds of Jews. He knows very well what happens when this will be found. So he drinks it. Then he takes the wine in the synagogue that is used for Havdalah, for the service at the end of Shabbos. He pours it in there, swishes it around, drinks the wine. And then fills it up with wine, puts it back where it was. He then goes back to learn. He goes back to... That's the most amazing part of the story as far as I'm concerned. Right? After this, he goes back and continues his study of Talmud. So he's sitting there calmly learning, and then a Christian mob comes in, led by this priest. They open the ark, they grab Rabbi Landau, they drag him out, they open the ark, and they say, "What is this?" And he looks at it, he says, "It's wine. We use it in the synagogue all the time." And the priest says, "No, it's blood." And he says, "Smell it." The priest smells it, dips a finger in it, it's wine. And, of course, the mob, thank God, dissipates, and Rabbi Chezkel Landau saves the day. As I said also, so anyway, that was the story here. Here is the vestibule. This is part of the original synagogue, but this is not the women's gallery. How do you tell this is not the women's gallery? Well, it would be very good. There's no windows, right? It's like, these are women's gallery, because at least there's windows. They can see it, they can see in here. But here, this was actually the vestibule of the synagogue, which we'll see soon. Anyway, here is the entrance. This part here is here. Right? In other words, we're looking at you'll see on the left is a picture from there, and on the right is this part. You see that? This was a large, you can see this is a locked door there. They'd keep the precious stuff. You know, the Torah scroll has all these silver things on it, right? And also there'd be money that was collected from the community. It would be kept, these were safes in which the stuff was kept. Right, here is the actual entrance to the synagogue. Very, very beautiful. And you'll see things are written on the wall. Here, this particular thing says, Es ha'elokim yarei, fear God, ves mitzvosav shmor, and guard his commandments. Ki zeh kol ha'adam, that's the entire essence of the human being. That's a verse in Ecclesiastes. There's many inscriptions on the wall here. One of the inscriptions is fascinating. There's one inscription on the walls of the Alt Neuschule which says, Nislabnu, it gives you the year in which the walls were whitewashed. It says, the walls were whitewashed, and it gives you the year. And people look at this and say, why are they doing this? Who cares what year the walls were whitewashed? if you look at the date, you'll see it's a few years after the great Rabbi Maharal of Prague passed away. And the story behind it is very simple. In the 14th century, that horrific massacre, which was witnessed by Avigdor Kara, who wrote the poem about it, that left bloodstains of Jews on the walls of the synagogue. The Maharal and rabbis all the way through up until the Maharal forbade the whitewashing of those walls. They wanted people to see what they did to us. As the verse says, Eretz al techasidam, let not the blood be covered by earth. We want there to be testimony and witness to what was done to us. So they didn't allow it to be whitewashed. Unfortunately, after the Maharal passed away, about a couple of years after he passed away, the heads of the community decided, forget this, we're going to whitewash it. So therefore, it's written there when the walls were whitewashed. Now, you'll see also, you'll notice a particularly interesting thing. That is, if you look up at the ceiling, what do you notice that is strange about that ceiling? Exactly. You see, it's a vault, but now you'd expect architecturally to be how many of these things?
8.
No, there should be 4. This is totally out of place here. Look at this. If you do a ceiling, which is a vault, you're supposed to have 4 of those. No, they stuck in a 5th, which is totally out of place, to avoid having a cross on the ceiling of the synagogue. Okay? And you'll see it on all the ceilings. You'll see this in Prague. The other place you'll see this is in Sfat. In Sfat, in the north of Israel, all the synagogues also are done like that. Here is the actual... Now you'll see this. You see this huge banner here? That banner dates back to approximately the 15th century. And that was the original flag and banner of the Jews of Prague. You'll see in the middle, there's a Magen David. And inside the Magen David, there's a hat. That hat was the hat that the Jews in Prague had to wear when they left the ghetto. Now, the only Jews who were allowed to actually leave were Jews who were noble, Jews who were wealthy, Jews who were influential. So that hat became a sign of nobility, and it was adopted as the symbol of the Jews of Prague. This is the actual bima. By the way, there are still services held in this synagogue every Shabbos. Every Shabbos, they pray 3 times a day in this synagogue. In fact, it's the oldest functioning synagogue outside of Israel. It's been functioning since 1320. There have been services held there. 1320. Right? It stopped during the Second World War, but there's still services. I prayed there a number of Shabbases, 3 Shabbases I prayed there. One Shabbos we were there, I was there with a group of kids, college kids from America, 40 college kids from America. We packed out the shul, right? There's the old community there, right? It's not a big shul. People sit around the outside there, etc. There's all the chairs packed out. There was a kiddush. There was a guy in the synagogue, it was his 91st birthday, and his wife, who he'd just married 2 years earlier, right? She was in her 80s. Right, he had never been married, and they got married, and she threw a kiddush for his party. So we were there. It was unbelievable. We were dancing, we were singing. It was an amazing, amazing thing. But the Alt Noshul, it's not a museum, right? People still daven, still pray in the Alt Noshul. Here is that's the chair that the rabbi would sit in. So you have this very magnificent chair, and of course a lectern in front of the chair. Again, here you see a detail. You can see it's like anyone with you don't need to be an artist to see that there's something wrong with that picture, right? They're just not even, right? It was done that way to avoid the cross. Here is a much clearer picture of the banner, and here you can see people would sit at these lecterns. I gave a class about the Maharal sitting there. I had a group of men there, and I gave a class about the Maharal's teachings in the synagogue where the Maharal actually was and taught, which is quite an uplifting experience. Here's the bima, the bima which we'll see later on, a picture of the Gabbai who I know. Now here is where the chazan would stand. What is different about this than you'll see in most synagogues around the world? What's different is here, I don't know if you can see that, but you see, for the chazan to get to where he prays, he has to step down. Right here is a step down. In fact, in most synagogues in the world, the chazan's quite high up, right? In traditional synagogues, all the way back to the Mishnah, the oldest synagogues, the chazan was always a step below the community. Because it says in Psalms, Mima'amakim kraticha Hashem. I call to you, God, from the depths. So he is, as a sign of humility and to call to God from the depths, he steps down. The other places you see this, you'll see this in Sfat, old synagogues in Sfat. You'll see this in ancient synagogues, and you'll see this here in Prague. Interesting, in the Mishnah, when the Mishnah describes a chazan, the language the Mishnah uses to describe a chazan is Yored Lifnei HaTeva, which means he who descends in front of the ark. Why does it call him he who descends? It's very simple, because he'd go a step down in order to beat the chazan. Is this clear to everyone? So, if you have a question, please feel free to ask. So that was and there's the ark. That's, by the way, about 500 years old, the ark, etc. Now, obviously, they did not have electric lights in the 1300s, but you'll see this. You see that? They have on the wall, you'll see all through the wall, it's hard to see it, but there was a very shiny copper. So what they'd have is, they'd have a candle or oil lamp in front of this, and it would be a convex surface, highly polished copper. What that would do is, the candle in front of it would reflect into the room and create more light. So you had these very beautiful polished copper things all around the wall in order to provide light. And of course there was, you see that window there? That window there is it's a sloping window. What happens is, usually when it comes to, when the sun is at a certain point, it shines right through that window. That indicates that it's the earliest time to pray. Here is a totally different sort. This is the Spanish synagogue. It's called Spanish because, obviously, you can see the style is what they called Moorish style, the Moorish style. It's a Moorish style synagogue. This actually was not an Orthodox synagogue. This is a later synagogue that was built in the 19th century, the 1800s, and actually it was a more of a, I guess, closer, something like conservative today. But although it's interesting, even there they did have a women's gallery, Ezrat Nashim, and but you can tell that it's not Orthodox. First of all, the instead of Hebrew here on the tablets, there is Roman numerals. That's usually a giveaway, right? And but it's a magnificent synagogue. Today, it is actually they have concerts in there, and there's a Jewish museum in that synagogue. You may ask yourself, of all the places in Europe, why are the synagogues in Prague so well preserved? There's two reasons for this. Reason number one, what happened? How did the Germans get hold of Czechoslovakia? Anyone know? How did the Germans conquer Czechoslovakia? It was given to them. It was handed over to them. Right? What's his name? Who was the wimp, the British Prime Minister? Chamberlain. Peace in our time. Part of the agreement was the German says, you can have Czechoslovakia and we'll be cool. And he comes back and says, I have a document in my hands from Herr Hitler guaranteeing, it sounds very similar, like I have a document in my hands from Hamas, from Al-Qaeda, from the PLO, from etc. That says there'll be peace in our times. What an idiot, right? But of course, hard to judge not being in his place. But nevertheless, Czechoslovakia was given, so the Germans just walked in. It wasn't bombed. It wasn't conquered. They just walked in there. That was number one. Reason number two, the Germans had plans that once they'd destroyed the Jewish people, they wanted to have a museum of the extinct Jewish race. The museum for the extinct Jewish race was going to be in Prague. So in fact, in Prague, the Germans accumulated stuff they stole from synagogues all over Europe, and they brought it all to Prague. We'll see pictures of this later. But that's why the synagogues and the whole Jewish quarter is so beautifully preserved. This is the Meisel synagogue. It is actually magnificent. It's not used today, but the Meisel synagogue was built by Solomon Meisel, who was a wealthy Jew in Prague, right, who built for his family his own synagogue. You know what I mean? You don't like the rabbi? Build your own synagogue. What the heck? Right? So he built his own synagogue. Ironically, it's one of the only synagogues that's almost never used. Right? But it was a private synagogue, and quite magnificent and very, very beautiful. Again, inside the Meisel synagogue there are exhibits, although most people do not go there, but it's quite a beautiful synagogue. Here is an interior of the Meisel. It's a weird, it's a panoramic 360-degree photo, so that's why it looks weird. But basically that's the interior of the Meisel synagogue, which, as you can see, is really quite ornate and very, very beautiful. Here is... this is called the Chevra Kadisha. We all know what the Chevra Kadisha is. The Chevra Kadisha literally means the holy society. The Chevra Kadisha is the society of the Jews who in every community volunteer to take care of the deceased. Right? And it's called the holy community. And in virtually every Jewish community around the world, there are people who voluntarily take care of dead bodies. They do the washing, they wrap them in the shrouds, they do the preparation and the care. It's called the Chevra Kadisha. The person responsible for most of the rules and the customs and the running of the modern-day Chevra Kadisha was the Maharal. The Maharal, aside from being a great scholar, was also a brilliant an expert in governance and administration. That's right, a brilliant administrator, and he wrote rules for the community. And one of the sections of the community that he was most interested in establishing ground rules and practices, because he knew perhaps he had an idea this would be used as a model by Jewish communities around the world, as in fact it was the Chevra Kadisha. So that's the building of the ancient. It says Chevra Kadisha, the holy society, Gomlei Chasadim. That means givers of kindness. Because really the Chevra Kadisha, why is it considered so holy? Because kindness to the deceased is ultimate kindness. No one's going to smile at you, right? No one's going to. The person you're doing the kindness for is not going to give you anything, right? Is not even going to give you a thanks, and so it's a thankless task. Right, and usually it is called Chesed Shel Emes, which means true kindness. It is kindness which is pure, right, and altruistic. And so Gomlei Chasadim, and there's the ancient. You see there again the Magen David. You see the hat. That's the symbol of the Jewish. And also in the Chevra Kadisha Shul, which is again dates back to about the 14th century, there is also a ceremonial hall that was used for communal gatherings, etc. And this is actually at the entrance to the old cemetery. Two other synagogues here. This is known as the Hoch Shul. Obviously, this was taken around Yom Ha'atzmaut, in the Israeli Independence Day. Hoch, what does Hoch mean? High. It was the high shul. Why is that? Because the high shul is built on the second floor of a building. It's attached to the Jewish town hall. The Hoch Shul was specifically built for the Jewish administration in the Jewish town hall. The administrators, that would be their synagogue. You're working in the Jewish town hall, you need to get afternoon service, so it's conveniently on the second floor. You just walk into the high shul and you can daven. Right, so it's actually exclusively used almost then just by the members of the Jewish council and of the Jewish community, the town hall. It's a beautiful thing. Can you imagine? Right, in the JCC, attached to the administrative offices, there's a small shul. So everyone who works at the JCC can just quickly get an afternoon service when they need so in the middle of the day. Anyone heard of a JCC like that? I haven't heard of it. But you know what? The JCC in Prague, that's what they had. The JCC in Prague, the Jewish town hall, they had the Hoch Shul. Today, by the way, it's still used. I got an afternoon service there. Afternoon service, right, in the Hoch Shul. So again, as you can see, very, very beautiful. This is probably the most beautiful synagogue in Prague, which is still active, and it's called the Jerusalemska Synagogue, or the Jubilee Synagogue. And that is a place where a lot of people, tourists, come to have bar mitzvahs there. Because obviously it's a lot bigger than the Alt Neu Shul, and apparently the acoustics is better, and that's where a lot of people have their bar mitzvahs, in the Jerusalemska Synagogue. Now we come to the old cemetery. The old cemetery of Prague, keep in mind, was started in about the 1300s. So you've got graves there from the 1300s. And keep in mind also, look at this jumble. This is just the top layer. They estimate at least 12 layers of graves underneath there. Right, there's one place there where it's particular, and it's quite high. It's above the ground. In other words, if you're walking on the street, this is quite a few feet above street level. There's also a hill there called the Hill of the Nephilim. A Nephil is a stillborn or a miscarriage, and there was a special hill in the cemetery that was preserved for them. And you have some of the old graves. This is the grave of one of the probably the oldest identifiable grave there. Can anyone read that? Avigdor Korah. That's the Avigdor Korah, who I said was a relative of Rabbi Yosef Korah of the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law. He's the one who, as a child, witnessed his parents being slaughtered by the Christian mob, and he's the one who wrote the beautiful elegy that we read on Tisha B'Av. That's his grave there. And as you can see, this is a magnificent, again, a lot of the graves, you can tell, like some of the graves, if it's a Kohen, a family of Kohanim, on the grave they will have hands doing that, which is the way that the Kohen holds the hands traditionally to give a blessing. So on the grave you'll have engraved on it, on the tombstone there'll be the Kohanim's hands of blessing. If there is a cup, like a cup for washing things on the grave, what would that be? A Levite, correct? There'll be a Levi there, right? And you can tell a lot of the people's jobs on the grave, you could tell by they'd have a specific engraving or a picture on that grave. Here is the grave of the Maharal. was obviously the most prominent grave in the cemetery, who's the most famous person buried there. To this day, people come and pray there, right, at his grave. Just a point I should make, it is common Jewish practice to go to graveyards and to pray at the tombs of the righteous. But I was very careful when I said to pray at the tombs of the righteous, not to pray to the tombs. Praying to a righteous person, we have a word for that in Hebrew, 2 words for that. It's called avodah zarah. That means idol worship. You're never allowed to pray to a righteous person, be that person alive or dead. But you're allowed to pray at their graves. In fact, the custom of praying at graves goes all the way back to Kalev, the son of Yefuneh, sent by Moses to Israel. The first place Kalev went when he went to Israel was to Hebron, to pray at the graves of Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, and Leah. Right? Now, the Mishnah Berurah, one of the great commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law, says, well, why do we pray at graves? If we don't pray to the person, what are we doing at the grave? He has 2 reasons. Number 1, a grave site of a holy person is a holy place. Here was, the human body is holy. If it's a receptacle of holiness, a receptacle of the soul, a receptacle of Torah, a receptacle of kindness, etc., there's a holiness to that. So praying at the graveside of that is praying at a holy place. In addition, on a very totally rationalist level, it's inspiring. To stand there at the grave of the Maharal of Prague and to be able to pray to God, right? And also it's a way of saying, I'm still attached to his beliefs. I'm still attached to his merit. I'm attached to this person. So that's why we visit graves and we pray there, but and you can see the jumble of the old cemetery. We'll see later on there's a new cemetery there. This is again one of those panoramic views of the cemetery. It's a little weird, but there you go, just to give you the impression that you walk, you can walk around all here, and there's pathways there. Obviously a Kohen would not be allowed to go to the cemetery, but they're just crowded together, incredible, right? Anyway, this is a little more of the cemetery, and you can see some of the more ancient graves. There again, you can tell generally the wealthy people and the rabbis, right, had the larger tombstones. There was a new cemetery created in about the 1700s. The Jews were allowed finally to build a new cemetery. When the communists came in, they appropriated the land and they built this monstrosity called any communist country go in Eastern Europe. You always find in the middle of the city? A gigantic television tower. It's like a communist. It's bizarre. There's one in Moscow. There's one in Budapest. There's one in Prague. Like the communists are crazy. I don't know. I mean, they're crazy for many reasons, but they had this thing about television towers. I don't know if anyone's been to Eastern Europe. Any major city in Eastern Europe got this gigantic television tower in the middle of the city. I don't know what it is. But in any case, right, this one is particularly weird because it's got these statues of kids crawling up and down the tower. You see that? You notice that? It's bizarre. In any case, it was built on half of that new Jewish cemetery. So, thank God, there was a Jewish businessman by the name of Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell, very famous Jewish businessman, fabulously wealthy. He died missing from his yacht. Rumours were going around that he used to work for the Mossad, this and that. Anyway, he was born in Czechoslovakia. And so he bribed the communists to save the second half of that cemetery. Because of Robert Maxwell, he had a lot of business connections in Czechoslovakia. He had a lot of personal connections there. And because of his influence, he was able to stop the destruction of the rest of the cemetery. So the other half of the cemetery that's the gravestone of Franz Kafka. That's in that part of the cemetery. And here is the gravestone of Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, who is known as the Noda B'Yehuda, meaning the one who was known amongst Judah. He was very famous for his what's called responsa literature. People would ask him questions, he'd give responses to their halachic questions. Fascinating stuff. And he was at the forefront of the fight at the time. He was actually one of the great opponents of the early Hasidic movement. He was known as one of the greatest of the Misnagdim. He was very opposed to the Hasidic movement. He felt that it was a deviation from Judaism, and he felt that there were practices they were doing that were totally inappropriate, and he fought tooth and nail against the Hasidic movement. Interesting to note, there's some questions there asked to him by Hasidim. What are they doing asking him questions? The answer is that everyone acknowledged he was like the greatest rabbi at the time. So if you had a good question, if you had a serious question, you've got to go to him. You don't agree with him, he doesn't agree with you, but everyone agreed. He is the greatest guy to go. You have to go to him. So was Yechezkel Landau. That's his tomb, again, in that new part of the cemetery. This is the Jewish town hall you'll notice a few things about the town hall. See, there's a clock. There's two clocks. One clock runs clockwise. The other clock, which is Hebrew letters, notice the order of the letters? It's anti-clockwise. See, Aleph, Base, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Va, right? The clock runs that way. And it's interesting, I'm not sure how they did it, but they say it's the same mechanism. I guess you could do it with gear, I mean, whatever. But anyway, everyone, they're all very proud that it's the same mechanism. Okay, whatever. Anyway, but basically, the Jewish town hall had the regular clock, and it's got this clock, and this clock, again, in Hebrew letters, running backwards. By the way, a lot of shuls in Europe, you specifically have clocks on the wall with Hebrew letters. There's even a responser. Someone once asked a rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Sofer of Pressburg if they're allowed to change the clock in the synagogue to regular numbers. And he forbade it. He said it's forbidden. And they said, why? He said, no changes in the synagogue whatsoever. Even minor changes lead to major breaches. Interesting. I read this. There's a magazine, I'm sure you've heard of it, called Moment magazine. So there was an article there once by a conservative rabbi. His congregation had bought an old Orthodox shul, right? So they had originally, they got money, they bought it, and then they decided they're going to renovate because it was old and it needed renovation. So we got an architect in there. They were praying there for a few months, right, until they got the money, maybe a few months till they got the money for the renovation, and then they had temporary headquarters somewhere, a public library or whatever, and then they did the renovation. So one of the renovations they did was they moved the bimah where the chazan stands. They moved it from the centre of the synagogue, as is traditional in synagogues throughout history, and they moved it to the front. And then, in addition to moving it to the front, they turned it around, so instead of facing the ark, it faces the congregation. So the rabbi writes, very interestingly in the article, he says, I didn't think anything of it because it's just a standard procedure. A conservative synagogue, so the bimah's at the front and it faces the community, instead of Orthodox where it's in the middle, facing the ark. He says, I didn't think anything of it. But he says, after a couple of months, I started to realise that there was a subtle psychological change in the community. You know what it was? They stopped being a congregation and they start being an audience. He says, when it was in the middle, facing the ark, and the chazan's leading us in our prayers, facing the ark, praying to God in the direction of Jerusalem, we're all participants, right? We're all in the congregation. He says, once it goes to the front and it faces you, then what are you? You're not congregants anymore, you are the audience. And he said he felt it. He felt it. He felt a drop in people's participation in the prayers. He felt a drop in people's enthusiasm, and there was a drop in attendance as well. He doesn't know if that was the only factor, but he writes a fascinating article about the change. And one of the things he says, I think to myself of this fanatical Orthodox rabbi back in the 1700s who didn't allow even to change the clock to regular numerals. He says, no changes. He says, you know what? Maybe he had something to it. Right? Maybe he had... Anyway, so that's the clock in the Jewish town hall. And here, of course, is the famous symbol of the Prague Jewish community, the Magen David, and of course that's the hat. You can see very clearly there that it's a hat. That's the hat that Jews would wear when they left the ghetto. That became the symbol. Even to this day, that's the symbol of the Prague Jewish community. Here is very shocking. You'll notice a crucifix. This is on what's called the Charles Bridge, and you look at it says on the crucifix. Look at that. Anyone read that? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Holy, 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 Hashem Tzvakot Shema is the Lord of hosts. It is a verse from Ezekiel, and we actually say it in our holiest prayer, the Kedusha, every single day, twice a day. What is it doing on a crucifix? So if you look at the Prague tourist brochures put out by the Czech Republic, and etc. I was flying on Czech Airlines, I'm reading through the thing, they talk about how a beautiful symbol of two religions coming together. Right? What a bunch of rubbish. Right? The actual origin of this goes back to 1696. Right? In the 1600s, there was the head of the Jewish community was a business rival of another Jew. And this guy, the head of the Jewish community, but his name was Elias Backhofen. Sorry, no, the head of the Jewish community was someone else. Elias Backhofen was the poor guy who was punished. But the head of the Jewish community, who the Prague Jews still curse to this very day, what happened was, see, he wanted to get rid of his business rival. He said, what better way to get rid of him? I'll accuse him of blasphemy against the church. So he forged a letter in the name of Elias Backhofen. He forged a letter which contained blasphemy against the Christian church. It got into the hands of the church, and the church immediately arrested Elias Backhofen, and they tortured him. Obviously, what's going to happen when the church tortures? They were experts in it, right? They've been doing it for centuries, right? And what happened? What do you think Elias Backhofen did? He confessed. He confessed to the blasphemy. What choice do you have? Right? He's been tortured. He'll say anything they want. And believe me, the tortures of the church make waterboarding look like a sport. Right? I mean, believe me, the CIA holds nothing, right, to the Inquisition, to the church authorities. And they tortured it out of him. And instead of giving him a death sentence, they sentenced him to years in prison, and they confiscated his property. And they made, with that property they confiscated, they dedicated, they put up, basically to just annoy the Jews, they put up a verse from our Torah in Hebrew on a statue of the crucifix. And if you look at you can't see it here, but there's an inscription on the base here, and on the bottom it says, this is part of the punishment for blasphemous Judaeus, the Jewish blasphemy of Jesus. So you walk along the bridge, all the tourists are saying, oh, it was beautiful, very nice, ecumenical, right? The togetherness of the religions, like they're touching, isn't it? Right? But of course, the real story is, and what's worst about it is, it was sparked off by a Jew in his hatred for a fellow Jew. His hatred for this Jew, his business competition to get ahead, this is what he created. So for all eternity, right, the desecration of God's name, the desecration of this verse, and the insult to the Jewish community in Prague, created by one selfish, hateful person in Prague. It's a lesson. You know, you walk on the Charles Bridge, that lesson is well worth it. What can be a result of baseless hatred and of one person's competition against another? That's on the Charles Bridge. Right, this is the Rudolfinum, which is a magnificent concert hall. And the Rudolfinum, you see on the roof there, see the statues? So the statues on the roof are statues of composers. Right? The statues of major composers. There's a legend about this, which is the following, that when the Nazis occupied Prague, I think it may have been Heydrich, who told one of his underlings to go up on the roof and to remove the Jewish composers. Who was the Jewish composer he wanted to remove? I forgot who it was.
Mendelssohn.
It may have been Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn. He said, get rid of the statue of Mendelssohn. So this Nazi goes up to the roof. He's an ignorant boor, right? He has no idea what Mendelssohn looks like. There's no names on the statue because it's up on the roof, right? He doesn't know what Mendelssohn looks like, so he looks for the statue with the biggest nose. And he rips it down, and it turns out he's pulled down the statue of Wagner. So, you know, there's not a lot of things to laugh about from the Second World War, but, you know, one or two things you can... One thing, that's the Rudolfinum. To this day, it's very beautiful. It's built in the honour of the Emperor Rudolf. This is the Gustav Mahler, of course, a Jew who was very assimilated. As I said, by the mid-19th century, a lot of the Jews had started to assimilate. They adopted German culture, German names. Many of them converted to Christianity, but certainly there was a mass abandonment of traditional Judaism. Franz Kafka, raised somewhat traditionally. Again, I put the Intercontinental Hotel, by the way, the Intercontinental Hotel is the closest hotel to the Altneuschule. Like, if you stay there, my room I think was there, but you can look out the window and you can actually see the Altneuschule. But the parking lot used to be a synagogue. That was the synagogue where Franz Kafka had his bar mitzvah. Right, so anyone wants to make pilgrimage to Franz Kafka's bar mitzvah shul, it's a parking lot of the Intercontinental Hotel. This is a very famous and ornate astronomical clock. It was commissioned by one of the kings there, the artist who did it spent years doing it. It was very complex and very beautiful. And what happens is every hour there's 12 statues that come out, symbolizing different hours. There's a statue of a Jew with a money bag, right, and symbolizing, of course, the Jew thieves. And, of course, after this artisan built the clock, the king had his eyes gouged out, had him blinded so that he wouldn't be able to do it for anyone else. So, you know, when you go to Europe, it's interesting. It's like type of thing, everything's a mixture. You know, you see this beautiful clock and everyone's marveling at it. You find out that the king who commissioned it, A, put an anti-Semitic symbol right there in the clock, and B, blinded the artist who did it so he wouldn't be able to do it for anyone else. It's always like that. I remember I was in Vienna. I was with a tour guide in Vienna, with a group of students in Vienna. We're standing there outside one of these... the architecture there is stunning. I mean, if you like architecture... When I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect. Right? So I spent a lot of time reading architecture. I've taught a whole bunch of architecture books at home. I used to... Right? Anyway, so I love seeing architecture. Really, I mean, I don't know. A lot of my kids think this is bizarre. They get very embarrassed when I'm pointing out any architectural feature. This is normal for kids. Right? They want to make themselves hoodies with extra long things in the front so they can pull them down when I embarrass them. Right? So anyway, I forbade this. Anyway, but basically, I'm standing there looking at this beautiful palace from the Habsburg era, and the balcony, magnificent ornate balcony, looks very familiar to me. And I said to the tour guide, I said, God, this balcony looks really familiar. He says, oh yes. He says, famous balcony. That's where Hitler gave one of his most famous speeches that sparked off some huge event against the Jews. He gave it on this balcony in Vienna. That's what it's like. That's what Europe's like. On the one you say, oh, beautiful balcony. Oh yeah, that's where Hitler spoke. Beautiful clock. That's where the guy, right? Or I see this beautiful church tower. And I'm saying, oh, Gothic. I said, oh, that's where the famous defenestration of Prague. There was a war between the Catholics and the Protestants, and it's called what's called the defenestration of Prague. Anyone heard of that? No. Defenestration means throwing out a window. There's actually a word for throwing someone out of a window, as in, I will defenestrate you. I'll throw you out the window. So that was a method of execution used. They would throw people out of the church tower. So I don't remember if it was the Catholics who threw out the Protestants or the other way around, but a whole bunch of priests, I think it were Protestants, were thrown out of this church tower in this infamous book called Defenestration of Prague. And what happened was, what they didn't know was that there was some farmer or someone who was in charge of collecting the horse manure who'd gathered it all in a pile under the church ready to take it away. You know, in ancient cities, right, one of the big problems with the accumulation of horse manure, in fact, horses and carriages cause more pollution than cars. There was more pollution in New York before cars than after cars, right? Why do you think tenements had high stoops, right? It's like, okay. Anyway, so what happened was these priests' lives were saved because they fell into the huge pile of manure. So those who threw them out said a fitting place for them to land, and those who were thrown out said a miracle, right? So you can interpret it as you want, right? I type of whatever, your own interpretation. But that was called the famous defenestration of Prague. You can walk around the town square there, and you can see all these things. I'm focusing on the Jewish history, but of course it's very rich in non-Jewish history as well. So those are some of the things there. Of course, with the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded and they really took it over without firing a shot, the Jews were, of course, trapped there. There's Hitler, Yamach Shemo, entering Prague, reviewing the troops as they come in there. Here is one of the synagogues, I believe it might be the Spanish synagogue, piled with, as you can see, junk. I mean, not junk, but basically piled with stuff that the Nazis confiscated from synagogues all over Europe and sent to Prague to be catalogued and stored there. And so the synagogues were literally stuffed with Torah scrolls and tefillin and the silver and the gold. And you can go into synagogues today. A lot of them have been converted into museums, and you can see the most magnificent collections of stuff. It's amazing. Just to give you an idea, not this synagogue, but in Rome. In the Rome ghetto, when the Jews, as you probably know, the Vatican created the ghetto, and they confined the Jews in Italy to ghettos. Venice was the first one, Rome, right? And the Jews of Rome had to live in the ghetto. And in addition, the church also, that's until the first secular king, Vittorio Emanuele, right, a great man who, as soon as he became king and took power away from the Vatican, allowed the Jews out of the ghetto. But anyway, so Vittorio Emanuele, but until the time of Vittorio Emanuele, the Jews in Rome were only allowed to engage in one trade, which was old clothing, old material. They could buy old clothes and fix it up and sell it, etc. So if you go to the great synagogue in Rome, the basement is a museum. Very worthwhile going. Very worthwhile going. The great synagogue in Rome, magnificent synagogue, services there 3 times a day. In fact, I think there are actually 30 synagogues in Rome, and you can get Shachris Mincha Marav every day. And it's great. Great kosher restaurants, by the way. Right? Best kosher restaurants in Europe are in Paris and in Rome. Anyway, but in Rome, right, in fact, modern Roman cuisine, much of it is based on ancient Jewish cuisine. But that's another lecture. So in the basement there, you walk in there, And there are hundreds and hundreds of mantles of Torah covers. Beautiful. Why? Because the ladies, the Jewish community in Rome, the Jewish women in Rome, they'd deal in old clothes, but they'd always take, if they found something really beautiful, they'd use it for the scroll, the covering of the Torah scroll. So there's a collection of hundreds of them in this museum. So it's amazing what you see. Again, there's always the positive and the negative, the bitter and the sweet. Yes, we're restricted to old clothing. There's one Torah scroll there, which I saw, it looked so weird. It had the Swedish royal symbol on it because apparently one of the princesses of Sweden died in Rome and the Jews were able to buy her clothing. So from her royal gown with the Swedish royal symbol on it, they made a Torah cover, a mantle of the Torah. So this type of stuff you can see. So in Prague, anyway, that's the synagogue which has all the stuff just piled to the rafters with things they confiscated from other synagogues. Here are Jews leaving Prague with their possessions, right, trying to escape. Jews at the railway station being taken. They're being sent to Theresienstadt. There, of course, is a Jewish child with the Jewish star, the yellow star, Yud, Jew from Prague. Of course, thousands were killed. I think it was something like 70,000 Jews from the area were murdered by the Nazis. There's a synagogue there called the Pinkas Synagogue, which has the name of every single Holocaust victim from Czechoslovakia written on the walls, with their birth dates and their day of their death, if they're known. Right, every single one. When the communists took over in Czechoslovakia, they whitewashed the walls. You know, and when I heard about that, I shivered because I remembered in the Alt Neuschule, and the sign said walls were whitewashed. And I remember what the Maharal said: let not the ground cover the blood of our ancestors. Let people see what was done. First thing the communists did, they whitewashed the synagogue. And you know what? When Victor, I don't pronounce his name, Hlavik, how do you pronounce his name? The Prime Minister, Havel, right. When he was very pro-Jewish, one of his campaign promises was that he would restore that synagogue. And one of the first things he did was actually restore the synagogue. And it's interesting, he came to visit the synagogue after the names were all restored, and they took off the whitewashing, and he didn't have a yarmulke. One of the heads of the Jewish community was very concerned, there's no yarmulke, and then he pulls out of his pocket a yarmulke, puts it on and walks into the synagogue. So he was a great man. But anyway, here's just to give you a detail of that. There you go. So if you look at it, you can read, you can stand there reading it. It's very sad. You know, you can see some people where, born 38, died 41. You know what I mean? You see that type of stuff. It's very sad. But here you can see people, you can see people's birthday, 1915 to 1947, 1856, 1942, 1913, 1942. I know people who were there who saw the names of their relatives there. The guy who took this photo, his name is Wellish, guy from America, and he saw his, he saw his relative right there. So that's quite amazing. You walk in there, and all the walls just covered with names and names and names. Today, the Czech Republic is very proud of its Jewish heritage. Of course, we had many ups and downs, as I mentioned. And today, at the Prague Town Hall, two of the statues at the Town Hall, that's a statue of the Maharal of Prague. Clearly, we don't know how he looked, but it's a statue of him. And this is a statue of the Golem. The reason I didn't mention the Golem till now is because it's a myth. But there is a very famous story that the Maharal of Prague, because there was a bishop by the name of Thaddeus who was involved in all types of accusations against the Jews, blood libels and the like, the Maharal, with Kabbalah, with his son-in-law and his greatest students, they gather together on the banks of Vistal River and they make a human shape out of clay, and it says each one of them, they walk around it and say certain verses. So one of them, who is a Kohen, he represents fire, right? And he walks around, says the verses, and the thing fills with red of fire. Then the other one, who's a Levite, symbolizing water, he walks around it and the fill things with water. And then each one, and then the Maharal finally puts the name of God on him, and he turns into this humunculus, this robot. In fact, robot is a Czech word. Robot's a Czech word. Right, and it actually, because the legend of the Golem was so powerful, all over in the airport in Prague, Praha Airport, right, every tourist store they've got to have little miniatures of the Golem. You can get little coffee cups with the Golem on it. It's a very famous thing. It's a statue of the Golem. Why do I say it's a myth? right? Because the Maharal had two students who were historians, neither of them mention it. In all of his writings, the Maharal mentions not a word about it, right? B, so that's A and B. C, there's no record of any Bishop Thaddeus ever in the entire Czech Republic ever in history, right? And D, we know that one of the first origins of it was a book by Judel Rosenberg, who was a very famous scholar. He was a great Jewish scholar, but he was also an author. And he has a bibliography of books that he wrote. And in the book about the Golem, which a lot of people accept as, oh yes, this is an authoritative account, he has it in amongst his fiction books. And that book is quoted by many people. So I hate to disappoint you, right? But there probably was no golem, right? And the legend is that it's in the attic in the Alt Neuschul, right? You saw there was a ladder going up the attic. No, almost certainly not there. And this, as you can imagine, is a statue which of course pays tribute to Franz Kafka. Fittingly, it's bizarre, right? Anyone who's read Kafka, you'll look at this and you'll say it fits perfectly, right? It's a classic Kafkaesque. There's even a word in English. You talk about something which is really bizarre and wacky, especially if it's to do with government bureaucracy. We have a lot of that in the United States now, right? So if it's bizarre and wacky, TSA, etc., right, you say this is Kafkaesque, right? I just heard someone describing today how he was at the airport, right? He's being searched. He's like, I don't know, he's a 60-year-old white guy, right? He's got a large crucifix. He's being searched, being patted down. There was a guy in the next row with a T-shirt with Osama bin Laden on the T-shirt. A turban and a Quran. They just right through because he was not chosen for the random search. And had they had chosen him, guess what? The community of American Islamic relations would be all over them for discrimination. Right? So anyway, that's what we call that. How would you describe that? Kafkaesque. Right? Kafkaesque. So that's again, to this day, that's what you have in Prague. You have the statue of the Maharal, you have the statue of the Golem, you have the statue of Franz Kafka, there's the Kafka Museum there, there's actually a yeshiva called the Maharal Yeshiva. Now we come to the modern day community of Prague, right? The Jews, as I said, there's only 1,600 in the community, but the community has a tremendous amount of money. Not the Jews themselves are not individually wealthy. There are some wealthy Jews, but the community chest is very filled. Why? Because most of the major tourist sites in Prague are Jewish. And there are millions of tourists come through a year. And who do they pay to get into the sites? And who gets the money? The Jewish community. So the Jewish community is very well endowed. And this is the Jewish Community Centre. There's a kosher restaurant there. We ate there, right? I took 40 students, college students. We had lunch booked at this place. We came in. They decided, they all went to non-kosher restaurants. So we ended up just eating. But it was decent kosher food, and it's subsidised. So members of the Prague Jewish community, a lot of them eat there every day because it's heavily subsidised, extremely cheap kosher food given at the community centre. There's two other kosher restaurants. One is called Shelanu, which is run by Chabad, and it's a Shelanu cafe restaurant. Interesting, it's a cafe, but guess what? It's no dairy. There's no dairy. Right. The reason there's no dairy is because it's Chabad custom. They only drink milk supervised by Jews from the time of milking until the time of throughout the production. That's not available there. So therefore, everything there is parv. So there's soy milk in the coffee. It's actually great coffee, right? And they serve, it's basically, you get pastrami sandwiches. It's a great restaurant, right? It's called the Shelanu Cafe. The other one, which recently opened, is called Dinitz. It's called the Dinitz restaurant, which is also a kosher restaurant there. And so you've got these three choices. You've got the Jewish Centre, which is called the Shalom restaurant. You've got Dinitz, which is right near some major hotels, and the Shelanu, which is literally right around the corner from the Alt Neuschul, right around the corner from the Intercontinental. I used to eat there all the time, right? It's a great place. And there is one Jewish school in Prague. There's the Lauder Foundation that sponsors Jewish schools in Eastern Europe very successfully, and there's a Jewish day school in Prague. There they are planting a tree on Tu B'Shvat, which is the New Year of Trees, according to the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. And there's the Jewish kids in the school today planting tree for Tu B'Shvat. Just to give you some of the Jews that I know, one I know, two I know, one I don't, in Prague today. Here is a guy I met there, David Kraus. He's the head of the union, the vice president of the Czech Union of Jewish Students. Guy is 18. And walk along with me. He knows the history of Prague back to front, right? He's a brilliant kid, right? He's read widely. He speaks fluent English obviously fluent Czech, fluent German. He's learning Hebrew, right? Very impressive guy. But you meet your average 18-year-old here, they're not very mature. They're college partying. This is a guy, he knows what he wants to do in life. He's working. He has like 2 different jobs while he's at college, right? Getting into college was a huge struggle. He's really working hard. He's already almost finished his degree. He's only 19, right? And he does a tour guide. He operates as a tour guide part-time. Very impressive. Here is a guy called Yaakov Schwab, who is a guy who grew up secular, became religious, and he is actually he's a tour guide, fantastic tour guide. He's also the gabbai of the Alt Neuschel. So he stands there on the bimah, and he'll point to people, and he gives aliyahs and stuff like that. He runs it very, very regally and royally, right? And he's a tour guide who lives there, and he makes his living by organising tour groups and buses and this and that, and giving tours of the area. Here's a guy. He and his brother Michal Gunsberger and his brother, they own a restaurant called the King Solomon Restaurant. It doesn't actually have supervision, but they claim it's kosher, so therefore it's not there. I wouldn't eat there, but he's got King Solomon's Bakery and Deli, where they sell packaged, so you can get your OU stuff, you get stuff from the States, you can get all the stuff with the kosher stuff from Europe, from England, etc. You can buy kosher groceries in Prague. This is actually a new thing. That he and his brother drive Harley Davidsons, and on the license plate it says kosher hogs. Because, that's the nickname for a Harley Davidson is a hog. So these are kosher hogs, right? So you see these 2 Jewish guys driving around Harley Davidsons in Prague, kosher hogs, and one brother owns the restaurant, the other owns a kosher grocery store. They're interesting guys. I met a woman there. She's a filmmaker, right? She works part-time as a tour guide, but she makes movies. It's an interesting, very cosmopolitan community, and a very fascinating group. There's a number of people who are becoming. There's a small group of young people who are getting more into Judaism. They're going to classes. There's an outreach center there. There's a yeshiva started not long ago by Chabad. It's called the Maharal, or the Yeshivat Maharal, or Yeshivat Maharal, where they study the works of the Maharal, amongst other things as well. And there's a small following there. And it's interesting, there's always Jewish groups going through Prague all the time. But what's amazing is that you go to the cemetery, the old Jewish cemetery, it is packed with tourists. 95% of the tourists who go to the Jewish cemetery, to the Alt Neuschel, are not Jews. Japanese tourists crowding around the tomb of the Maharal. Like what? It's bizarre. Whatever. Because he was an impressive person. He wrote like 25 volumes at least of philosophy, of Kabbalah, etc., etc. Amazing man, a communal leader, a great administrator, a righteous person, and said, the story. It was at the time. It was quite normal. When you got married, before you got married, the father of the bride would of course have to come up with a huge dowry, right? So this Maharal, he was young, he was he was one of the most greatest scholars of the time. So a very, very wealthy man said, made an agreement with his, a shidduch with his daughter. He's going to marry her daughter, and he promised him a huge amount of money. What happened was, in the meantime, before they got married, right, they were going to get married like a year, and in the meantime there was a huge pogrom and expulsion, and this man lost every cent. Lost everything, right? Maharal refused to break the engagement, right? I mean, that would have been a totally normal thing to break an engagement under circumstances like that. He refused to do so, and waited and his wife apparently was a very astute businesswoman. She picked it up from her father. She'd worked with him, and she accumulated actually a fair amount of wealth after they got married. But he married her despite the fact that they went into poverty, and that's why the Maharal got married quite late in life. They simply couldn't afford to get married. They couldn't afford to, right? Anyway, that was the Maharal. But again, it's amazing. Just like, I guess 98% of the people there are just not Jewish who go around and come to these places. Anyway, that's it for Prague. You don't have to go now. Actually, you should still probably go. Right, that's it for Prague. I do hope at some point in the future, I would very much like to do a virtual tour of Israel. But of course, that's not going to be 1 hour. That's going to be like, days and days of stuff. The only reason I hesitate to do that is because I don't care if you visit Prague or not. But I want you to visit Israel. So I feel if I do this and you say, okay, I don't have to go to Prague anymore, so what? Big deal. So the Czech Republic will not get your bucks, right? I don't care, right? I don't want to do Israel because I want you to go to Israel. Everyone should go to Israel. You don't want to do a virtual tour of Israel. I want to do Israel itself. Anyway, thank you very much. It's been very nice. Have a great summer.